We begin this chapter with Louis XIV ruling France, which he did from May of 1643 to September of 1715. Remember, he took the throne at 5 years old. He was an absolutist monarch. He worked to strengthen France and the monarchy. He will live 77 years. He ends up living so long that he outlives his son and his grandson. When he dies, his great-grandson becomes Louis XV and will rule France from September 1st of 1715 to May 10th of 1774. Now, Louis XV was no Louis XIV. He lived a very lavish and luxurious lifestyle. And while Louis XIV had also done that, Louis XV pays very little attention to the actual governance of France, to continuing to strengthen the monarchy, etc. It is Louis XV who gets involved in the French and Indian War in the Americas. And in that involvement, what he does is he supports the Indians in their opposition to the British, and that results in a lot of debt. Now, that same war that's called the French and Indian War in the Americas, elsewhere in the world is called the 7 Years' War. It is the same war. That 7 Years' War lasts from 1756 to 1763. And what you're seeing here on the screen is a map of all of the territories that were involved in the 7 Years' War. And what I often say is that this is the first global war. The 7 Years' War is actually the first world war. But it's called the 7 Years' War. It lasts 7 years. The territories that are involved are on every continent except Oceania. France, in fighting this war, runs up huge debts. Huge debts. It is incredibly costly for them. They lose. And in losing the 7 Years' War, they're going to have to give up New France to Great Britain. Now, New France is what we think of today as Canada and their territories around the Great Lakes. They retain Louisiana. They do not lose Louisiana in the 7 Years' War. France loses any supremacy they had had in India, and they have to destroy any of their fortifications that they have at trading posts in India. This is essentially going to give Britain the upper hand and unrestricted control over European trade with India. That's going to be important later. Spain has gotten involved in the 7 Years' War, and they're going to give up giving Florida to Britain. So Spain will lose Florida to Great Britain. France gives Louisiana not to Britain, but to Spain. So France gives up Louisiana to Spain. Great Britain will return Cuba and the Philippines to Spain. All of this is going to come up again. Okay. Now, while Louis XV is ruling, his son, Louis the Dauphin, Dauphin is what we say for crown prince in French. Okay. In April of 1770, he will have a proxy marriage with Marie Antoinette. She is an Austrian princess. She is the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa. Now, the proxy marriage means that one of Louis's representatives goes to Austria and conducts the wedding on Louis's behalf. The marriage contract is only completed after Marie Antoinette submits to 3 months of oral surgery because the French representative who went to check her out as marriage candidate thought her teeth were too crooked for her to be the queen. So she has to go through 3 months of oral surgery, no anesthesia. So how excited could she have been to marry this guy? Her own brother stands in as the proxy at the wedding. Fun. At the time of their marriage, Marie is 14, Louis is 15. When she gets to France in May 16th, 1770, they have the ceremony of marriage. It's not the official marriage. That was the one that took place in Austria. But now they're actually standing face to face and getting married. That evening will be the bedding ceremony. And the bedding ceremony is kind of odd. Remember, the queen has to be a virgin so that we know that any child conceived is the king's. And so what happens is the whole court goes in and puts them to bed after being shown that there are fresh, clean, white sheets. And then after they get them tucked in, the court goes and they sit outside and they wait. And I think we all know what they're listening for. Nothing is heard. The next morning, the maids go in, remove the bed sheets. Everybody expects to see a blood stain. There is not one. Night after night after night after night. We'll come back to this, but it's pretty clear that the marriage is not being consummated. In 1774, Louis XV will die, and Louis XVI becomes the King of France, and he's going to rule until September of 1792. While he is king, and shortly after, the American Revolution begins, actually in 1775. As a result of the American Revolution and France's support of the American colonies, France is going to get a little bit of land back that they had lost in 1763. Also, as a result of the American Revolution, Spain will get Florida back from Britain. Now, Louis XVI offers support to the American colonies. Why would he do this? He does this not because he believes in supporting the American colonies, because after all, they're opposing an absolute monarch. And Louis believes himself to be an absolute monarch. Well, they're not opposing an absolute monarch. They're opposing a constitutional monarch. But anyway, a king shouldn't be interested in supporting a revolution against another king. But what France is doing here, what Louis sees, is that he's not necessarily supporting opposition to another king. He's supporting opposition to Britain. And remember, France hates Britain. So any opportunity to hurt them, he's going to take. So he starts sending money and whatever assistance he can to the American colonies. This causes some financial difficulty. Remember, France is already in huge debt from the 7 Years' War, just a decade earlier. A man by the name of Jacques Necker becomes Director General of Finances, and he'll hold this spot for about 5 years. He can't be the Minister of Finance because he's Protestant, but he can be Director General of Finances. It's a nifty little step around the rules. He reforms France's finances, or starts to reform France's finances, but he gets blamed for the huge debt that runs up from assisting the colonies in the American Revolution. So he's ticked that he gets blamed for this debt that he didn't get asked about. Louis said, we're helping the colonies make it happen, and Jacques is supposed to make it happen. So he's tired of that blame. He resigns. He retires. Finally, in August of 1777, 7 years after they were married, Marie and Louis consummate their marriage. Marie's brother, Joseph II, you remember him, the Emperor of Austria, has visited Versailles. He's there for 5 weeks. He's come to try and figure out why the marriage hasn't been consummated yet. Because Marie's been sending letters to her mom. Her mom is concerned that she's not being a good wife. There really should be a baby in this marriage. This is a little ridiculous. What Joseph discovers is that they haven't consummated the marriage because Louis XVI has a medical condition that makes, shall we say, excitement very, very painful for him. There's a tissue attachment that makes an erection painful. And so there's a very, very simple medical procedure. It just goes in and snips that tissue. And Joseph convinces Louis to have that done. It's no longer painful for Louis to be excited. And within 8 months of the procedure, Marie Antoinette is pregnant. So it's a positive thing. But the damage that has been done in the 7 years where their marriage was not consummated, where it was clear that Louis was not interested in Marie, where Marie was spending far too much time talking to other men of the court, the tongues of the people of France have been wagging, and her reputation has been damaged. In February of 1778, France recognizes the United States as a sovereign nation. Now remember, by 1778, the American Revolution is still being fought. It's still highly contested. Nobody is sure who's going to win. And so this is kind of a gamble. The goal in doing this is to further weaken Great Britain, keep them from getting too powerful. And remember, the French lost the 7 Years' War, which they had fought against Britain. So they want a little revenge here, perhaps. A little stick in the eye for Britain. When they recognize the U.S. as a sovereign nation, France will sign a military alliance, and they actually go to war with Britain. They will provide weapons, grants, which are just gifts of money, loans. They actually send an army to serve under Washington. You may be familiar with the Marquis de Lafayette. They send a navy, and that navy that they send is going to be huge. When Washington gets the British backed up at Yorktown, it is actually the presence of the British Navy that keeps the Brits, or the presence of the French Navy that keeps the Brits from getting onto ships and escaping and living to fight again another day. The total cost of France's support of the colonies in the American Revolution is about $13 billion in today's dollars. That is a tremendous amount of money. Okay, now remember, Jacques Necker had resigned or retired in 1781. We're going to fast forward a little bit to 1788. He's back. He's going to become Director General of Finance. He's become a minister and a member of the King's Council. And this is a little bit of bending because Necker is still Protestant. Now, if you look, he's only going to be here for 18 months, a year and a half. Here's what he does while he's there. He bans grain exports. France was having trouble feeding her own people. And it takes Necker to come in to the finance office and say, you know what, if we can't feed our own people, maybe we shouldn't be exporting grain. He cannot solve a crisis in the Estates General that revolves around how they vote and perceived unfairness. He refuses to attend a meeting of the King's Council. He feels like he's not getting listened to. And Louis dismisses him. That's why he leaves so suddenly. Now, the dates are critical here. He leaves after being dismissed by Louis. And Louis is going to kind of scapegoat Jacques. He's going to blame Necker excuse me, for some of his problems. When they're not Necker's problems, they're really Louis's problems. Okay. Now, Louis's big problem is he has no money. He's spent a ton of money. His father had spent a ton of money. And so France is tremendously in debt. The number one way that a government will go about solving its debt problem is to raise taxes. And so Louis is in a situation. He can't raise taxes anymore by himself. He actually needs the permission of the people to raise taxes. So he will convene the Estates General. It's kind of like Parliament, but don't think of it as like Parliament. It's a representative body. he had assembled the Estates General in 1788 to try and get some money out of them. It hadn't gone well, so he dismissed them. Prior to that, the Estates General had not met for 140 years. They weren't needed because they had a strong absolutist monarch in France. Louis XVI is not a strong monarch. The Estates General is convened in 1788. It takes a year for them to hold the elections for everybody to travel, and so they finally meet on May 5th. Louis had granted the Third Estate double representation. What that means is the Third Estate is the peasants and the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie are the middle class. Okay, they're the folks who come from the peasantry, but they've got a little education. They have real jobs being accountants and bookkeepers and merchants and stuff, but they don't have any of the status of nobility. Okay, there are 3 estates in the Estates General. The first estate is the clergy. The second estate is nobility. The third estate is the peasants and the bourgeoisie. The voting in the Third Estate works like this. Each estate gets 1 vote. So there's 3 total votes in the Estates General. When Louis granted the Third Estate double representation, they thought that meant that they would get double the votes. So they're a little disgruntled when it turns out they don't. Now, this body is bigger than anybody that's ever met before, and they haven't met in 140 years. So when they show up, they're meeting in a temporary hall that's been constructed in the village of Versailles outside the palace. Upon showing up, rather than starting to discuss the taxation issue for which Louis had summoned them, they immediately start debating the vote. And the problem is going to be this. You've got clergy in one group, nobility in another, peasants and bourgeoisie in another. The clergy and nobility are going to vote together, and they're going to vote to raise taxes on whom? The peasants. Of course they're going to raise taxes on the peasants. Now, who probably has the most ability to pay? The clergy and the nobility. But if either one votes to tax the other, then the other will vote to tax the other, and they're all going to get taxed. So as long as they stand together, the peasants can't outvote them, and it's only the peasants who end up bearing the tax burden. Okay, so the National Assembly is going to meet from June 17th to July 9th of 1789. I'll tell you how we get there. It happens with something called the Tennis Court Oath. A bunch of folks in the Third Estate had, on June 17th, begun calling themselves the National Assembly rather than the Estates General. This irks the king and his ministers, and so on the 20th of June, when they show up, these members of the Third Estate find that they've been locked out of their meeting hall. And so they go and they meet on the King's Tennis Court. While they're there, they take an oath to remain until they've written a new constitution for France. This oath is known as the Tennis Court Oath. It's ultimately signed by 576 men. They get locked out of the tennis court 2 days later, and they'll meet in the Church of St. Louis, where the clergy will end up joining them. At that point, they can't be ignored anymore. So the king actually goes to the church and meets with them and says, break it up. He orders them to disperse. They refuse because, remember, they had taken the tennis court oath. So for a little bit of time, this group is going to be known as the National Assembly. You will have to know the order of these governments. So you have the Estates General, then the National Assembly, which results from the Tennis Court Oath. The National Assembly will morph. It's going to now be known as the National Constituent Assembly. The National Constituent Assembly will meet from July 9th to 1789 to September 20th of 1791. It's still the same group as the National Assembly, they just rename themselves. So it's another name you have to put in that order. Okay? The National Constituent Assembly will ask the king to remove the troops that he's placed around Versailles and Paris. He's placed troops in camps all around Versailles and all around Paris. The king refuses. Instead, he offers to move the National Constituent Assembly to a location directly between the two armies ringing Paris and Versailles. What that would do is cut them off from support from Paris. Strangely enough, the National Constituent Assembly declines. The National Constituent Assembly poses enough of a threat to Louis that he again summons Jacques Necker, names him again Director General of Finance. He's pretty convinced that Necker is the only one who can solve his problems. Unfortunately, there's nothing Necker can do fast enough to prevent the next big mess, which is the storming of the Bastille. This is an event and a date you need to know. It marks the beginning of the French Revolution. July 14th, 1789. July 14th is celebrated in France, much like the 4th of July is celebrated here. It is a pivotal and important date. And I want you to note that the United States becomes an independent nation fully and completely prior to the beginning of the French Revolution. So what's going on with the storming of the Bastille? It is a fortress and a prison in Paris, and it is viewed by the people as a symbol of the Ancien regime. Ancien, when you look at it, looks like it says ancient. So the Ancien regime is the old regime. To the French people, this is anything prior to representative government, anything before the summoning of the Estates General. So in the order of governments, you actually now have the Ancien regime, then the Estates General, the National Assembly, the National Constituent Assembly. Okay? What's in the Bastille? Why would the people storm it? It is full of arms and ammunition. The people are irritated by, they are afraid of the troops who are massing around Paris. So they want to be able to defend themselves should those troops take action. So they storm the Bastille and they capture the armory, and they release some of the prisoners in the Bastille. Now, what the people have come to believe is that those are political prisoners of the king. In fact, many of them were murderers, thieves, rapists, but they are liberated in the name of revolution. Bastille Day is celebrated, and that's what it's known as Bastille Day. This is the true beginning of the French Revolution. What do they get? Gunpowder, which was huge. You can't just go and make gunpowder at home. They release 7 prisoners. The governor of the prison is massacred by the mob. And the city government of Paris will order that the Bastille be torn down. Remember, they don't have bulldozers and wrecking balls. The Bastille is torn down by the people with their hands, stone by stone by stone. If you go to Paris and you think, oh, I want to go see the Bastille where the French Revolution began, you can't. It was torn down, the ground was built upon, those stones are scattered throughout buildings all over Paris. So, what happens? We've got the beginning of the French Revolution, the mobs of Paris are armed, now what? We get the August decrees issued by the National Constituent Assembly. And what those August decrees do is they abolish feudalism and they eliminate tithes. A tithe is a regular contribution to the church of a certain percentage of your income. So the August decrees say no more feudalism, no more tithes. And then later in that month, the National Constituent Assembly is going to issue a new document. It may sound a little familiar to you. It is called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This is a document you need to know. You need to be able to give its name correctly. It is not the Constitution that the National Assembly had promised to write. What it is much more a statement of principles. Okay? It is not like our Declaration of Independence, which was a list of complaints about the king. The Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen is a statement of principles. And the most important ones are that men are born free, they remain free, they are born equal in rights, and remain equal in rights. And what the French are saying through the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is that a peasant is as equal as a noble, as is equal as a clergyman or a cardinal or the king. The French are saying we are all equal. Now, where does this idea of equality and equal rights come from? It comes from the Enlightenment and folks like Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau. Remember what John Locke said: if a government isn't taking care of its people the way it needs to, the people have the right and the duty to overthrow that government. And this is what the French are doing. The Enlightenment has to be seen directly as a cause of both the American and the French revolutions. And the American Revolution is definitely a cause of the French Revolution, not just because it showed that Enlightenment principles could be enacted, but also because of the debt incurred by the French monarchy in supporting the American Revolution. And here is one of those historical ironies. The French got involved in the American Revolution just to stick it to the British. And yet, in so doing, they sucked up enough debt for themselves that their own people came after them, and ultimately it results in the fall of the French monarchy. So, a little bit of irony there. This is where we'll stop for today. We will pick up tomorrow with the March to Versailles.